It's lovely to see such a crowd out to hear something else of our history. I think we're trying to cover all kinds of perspectives in this particular year. I think Margaret and I will both be quite glad when this year of centenaries is over. The suffrage debate has been, well, it sort of keeps continuing on, you know. The woman question, if you like. But it's nice to look back and reflect on what women did in the past, what their hopes and aspirations were, and their disappointments. So, I'll get going with it. In these decades, during which Ireland suffered civil disruption, world war, and dramatic constitutional change, a minority of women, proactive and vocal, made their own impact on history. While women had participated in public campaigns, both political and social, in previous periods, their activities during these years was particularly noteworthy. The causes to which they gave their time, energy, support and commitment were diverse and sometimes conflicting, and would affect the lives of future generations of Irish women. Speaking in, what is all working, it's great. I have had past experiences, believe me. Speaking in 1913, Countess Markievicz claimed that there were three great movements in contemporary Ireland: the national movement, the women's movement, and the labour movement. Quote, all fighting the same fight for the extension of human liberty. This fight will be our focus this evening. One thing I should say, in order to give a talk or a lecture or putting things all together, it's quite difficult to disentangle the threads of different movements because everything's actually happening at the same time, and I can't tell it all at the same time. So you do need to bear that in mind, particularly I think for this evening. But what I'll do is I'll go through the sequence of events. I want to first of all talk about the context of, just before this period, the more recent changes which were relevant to women and had an impact on what they were searching for. Trade unionism, municipal votes, and education. These latter two probably most important, but working women had begun to make real progress in these years. You know all the whole story of industrialisation and the difficulties that caused for many women. And the fact that trade unions were mostly male-dominated, and in fact, those male trade unions were usually quite determined to exclude women because women were paid less than men. The battle was for a family wage to keep a man, his wife and children, and women were therefore paid less. So obviously it wasn't in men's interests to be supporting women, but despite that, women were making slow progress into trade unionism. People like Mary Galway and Winifred Carney, who we'll begin to hear more about later, were starting to make a real difference. The textile unions of the late 19th, early 20th century were really quite important in beginning to give women a voice and, you know, starting that whole thing of solidarity, the idea that workers needed to help each other out. Dublin Irish Women's Workers' Union in 1911 was probably the biggest sign of things that were to come. The municipal vote, it's these last two that are maybe more directly relevant to what we're talking about. From 1896, women could become poor law guardians. The passing of the Municipal Government Act of 1898 gave them the right to vote in local government if they were householders. And by 1911 they were able to go to sit on county and borough councils. Now, not a great number of them did involve themselves in local government, but it did give a minority of women an opportunity to gain experience in local politics, in their own areas, about things that they were familiar with. So they were getting experience, but they were also further encouraging the campaign for the national vote. Moreover, education, very important. The right to gain academic degrees from the Royal University of Ireland, opening the door to the professions, meant again that women were making steady progress in worlds that hitherto they had been completely excluded from, offering further opportunities for entering the professions, for example, but also more justification for the ongoing struggle for the right to vote. The important woman here in forwarding these advances, as far as Ulster was concerned, and it was sort of following in the footsteps of some English women as well. Advances in the middle of the 19th century. It was lobbying by a couple of very progressive women who made change possible. This is Isabella Todd and Margaret Byers, who opened Victoria College in Belfast. Isabella Todd was an extremely important woman. She was called the most prominent woman in Belfast at the end of the 19th century. This is Victoria College, which Margaret Byers opened in 1859. And why it was so important was because it offered girls an academic education. Those of you who are familiar with Middlemarch will remember, it was Rosamond, wasn't it? You know, education for middle class girls, usually via a governess, was about, you know, doing a bit of embroidery, maybe a bit of language, music, how to be a good wife, really. That's what it was about. So, being able, and this is all to do with the rise of the middle classes, again, because of industrialisation. It's the beginning of that bigger shift that you see, and this is why the context is so important, where the new rising middle classes, they are men making their fortunes, buying the big houses, having all these sons and daughters who they need to find progress for. And usually, you know, the sons would go into various professions, but what about the daughters? So it became seen as very important for these middle class girls to gain an education. And again, it was women like Todd and Byers who lobbied the government when certain acts were going through Parliament. These were acts that were just about boys and men. But they went with other English women and so forth and lobbied and protested. So, for example, the 1878 Education Ireland Act was about getting boys at secondary level to sit exams. Again, not, you know, you didn't move up through the Army, Navy and everything else anymore so easily, just through who your parents were and who your family was, and members of the aristocracy and so forth. This is the beginning of promotion by merit, and you know, proved your merit by sitting academic exams. But that act, setting up those public exams, was only for boys until the lobbying was successful and the exams were open to girls as well. That was very important because there was a real belief that girls, if they did brain work, everything else would suffer. Remember Darwin's around this time as well, you know? And that's why you get this image of the blue stocking woman, you know, she's doing all this brain work. Mm-hmm. So she's not able to have vibrant, healthy children and so forth. So being able to do public exams and prove their academic capabilities was very important at this stage. And then a year later, the 1879 Universities Ireland Act was really all about religion and politics and so forth. It was setting up the Royal University of Ireland, which was really just a combination of the Queen's Colleges in Cork, Galway and Dublin. And that Royal University of Ireland, when it gave degrees, the degrees were open to women as well as men. And again, it was only through lobbying that was made possible. Isabella Todd had pushed and pushed for this for years. These are the first women graduates in Ireland, the 9 Graces, as the newspapers call them, which you know, was a wee bit sexist, but I guess we'd say now. But I, for me, it's a very inspirational photograph. It's not that long ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, when women began to be able to get degrees. So I think that this changing context is very important, not least because as the male franchise continued to broaden, as Anna Haslam said, here we are now able to get degrees, okay, us women. So it's not easy to keep our temper when we see the most illiterate labourer with no two ideas in his head, exercising the very important function of self-government, while educated women capable in every way of giving a rational vote are still debarred. So you see why I think that context is important. We all have this image of people chaining themselves to railings and throwing themselves under horses or whatever, and these things happened. But I think my emphasis is always on the reasons why women were doing these things, the arguments that they put forward, and then of course the frustration of their disappointments. The North of Ireland Women's Suffrage Society was founded by Isabella Todd as the very first suffrage society in Ireland in early 1870. It soon was associated with Dublin Suffrage Society, led by Thomas and Anna Haslam, who were Quakers. And at this time, you got the formation of societies right throughout, not just Ireland, but in various places across the world. Doing a bit of work in Australia and so forth. It's very interesting. These suffragists all communicated with each other. We know more about the Pankhurst probably. I grew up knowing about the Pankhurst vaguely. I never knew till I began doing my own research that there was a similar movement of a similar size proportionally in Ireland. So we see all these societies being formed. They're usually quite small. These are always a minority of women. And people like Isabella Todd travelled around villages and towns of Ulster, all around towns like your own town, gathering together a few women, street corner talks and speeches, writing petitions, lobbying ministers, all that kind of thing. And you would have had maybe, a suffrage society for actresses, one for teachers, one for, I don't know, maybe Presbyterians or whatever. You had lots and lots of little groupings and societies. By the early 20th century, however, we see a whole new generation of women, I think, reflecting their changing social status. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, who's a very important suffragist, probably the most important woman in Ireland as far as suffrage was concerned at this time, and Margaret, of course, has done an awful lot of work on her. But when she was at university, she was asked to join a suffrage society and said, I was in an undergraduate and I was amazed and disgusted to learn that I was classed among criminals, infants and lunatics. In fact, that my status as a woman was worse than any of these. Because you can't change that. Well, you couldn't then anyway. So, again, that educational shift is a very important one. She became a convinced feminist immediately, and as I say, was one of the most prominent suffragists in Ireland. And throughout this time, you got women continuing with their lobbying, peaceful protests, and so forth. As Anna Haslam said, that, good solid rationale for what they did. Women are citizens of the state, inheritors with men of all the history which ennobles a nation, guardians with men of all the best life of the nation, bound as much as men are bound to consider the good of the whole, and justified as much as men are justified in sharing the good of the whole. So there are mutual benefits and mutual responsibilities there. There are ideas. This is you'd see women marching all over the place. Okay. Their ideas were publicised through the Irish Citizen paper, and if any of you are really interested in this, several libraries and public record office and so forth have copies of the Irish Citizen. It ran from 1912 to 1920. It was edited by, its first editor was Frank Sheehy Skeffington. This was the banner. For men and women equally, the rights of citizenship. From men and women equally, the duties of citizenship. Again, stressing those two angles. It's Hannah Sheehy Skeffington again. This is Winifred Carney. Important as a trade unionist who worked with Connolly in Belfast at this time, and who was head of the secretary of the textile union there. It's quite an interesting photograph. I have the next one somewhere in the sequence, which shows a policeman grabbing the woman on the right there, and two of them were arrested at this time. But the Citizen newspaper gives you all kinds of information about these women and their various demands, and they had a lot of different demands. They set up, for example, a court committee, so that women from the suffragist societies would go and sit in the courtroom, and maybe a man was being tried for beating his wife. The one example that I remember best was a man who was accused of jumping up and down on his wife, obviously causing severe damage. And, you know, said in the paper that the magistrate sort of gave him a rap across the nipples. You know, not taken seriously, I know, still taking a long time and hasn't changed very much. But for these suffragists, they felt, well, they could do something about it. They needed women to sit on juries, be part of the legal system, be part of the legislation, all of that in order to help overturn these injustices. Now, some of them wanted women to get to vote on the same terms as men, with a property qualification. Some wanted to go further than that. Lots of mixed ideas. And another interesting point I always feel when I'm reading through this stuff and hearing what these women said, because I think it would still happen if I went round the women, and indeed the men, in the room tonight. A lot of women wanted to vote because they wanted to be equal with men. Fairness, equality, we want the same thing. But a lot of women wanted to vote because they said women were different from men and could therefore bring something different to the whole system of government. Now that's still one that is debated. It becomes easier as we get more women up there and we can see how it works. But it's an interesting point that a lot of people feel quite strongly about. They also, particularly in places like Belfast, but really in the linen and cotton mills all around the place, wanted to stop what they called sweated labour. And again, Winifred Carney had, with Connolly, written a whole manifesto about the slave workers of Belfast and the mills. And you see the background of industrialisation. The appeal of womanhood. This kind of poster was very common. You know, wanting to help working women. There were some working women involved, not a great many, because middle class women had the education, the time and the means to travel, to make speeches, write articles and so forth. The white slave traffic that they wanted to stop is a reference to a kind of sensational series of stories in the English press about young women being kidnapped and taken to work in Chinese laundries. I've never worked out how much exaggeration or anything else there was in there. But I always think of these things now. Okay, we've done a lot for working women. Things have changed very much. We've done a lot in terms of the law, in terms of domestic violence, but I'm told by Monica McWilliams, who's done a lot of research in this, that things are worse now here than they were before. And what about this trafficking? This kind of white slavery, or any kind of slavery, we still have it. So there are many problems still to be resolved. Mrs. Chambers also put forward a very clear piece of rationale. You remember, women could become doctors by this stage. And she says, the law says a woman's quite competent to perform a surgical operation. Yet not to be able to tell the difference between Joe Devlin, the Belfast Nationalist leader, and Sir Edward Carson, the Unionist leader. If it were women's work to fit children to go into the world, it was equally important to see that the world was a fit place for their children. Again, that rationale, building on the progress that women had already made, they needed to be able to progress further. And I like that wee last bit there, because it reminds me of Mary Wollstonecraft writing at the time of the French Revolution, who again was echoing these kinds of sentiments. You know, that if women are mothers, motherhood is very important, and mothers need to be educated. You know, that their place and their status in society should be respected and upheld. So, you know, really wanting to diminish these injustices, to change the way things were done, to bring women's voice into the lawmaking progress. However, they had growing frustration from all sides. The status quo looked as if it was going to just stay like that forever. The suffrage campaign also received very little support from the general public. They were very often mocked by the public, even before any kind of militancy or anything started. I have the memoirs of Elizabeth Hutchinson, who was a daughter of a woman called Margaret McCoubrey, Belfast woman, well, Scottish woman who came to live in Belfast that I've done quite a bit of work on. And the memoirs are just really very interesting because they throw a completely different light on things, because Elizabeth Hutchinson was remembering when she was a child and said she used to be mocked walking down the street. My ma's a suffragette, she wears a collarette, marching up and down with her bloomers hanging down, my ma's a suffragette. And she said that she was just really embarrassed at the use of the word bloomers, you know. But there was a lot of this mockery going on. There was another occasion when the McCoubrys were at Whitehead, where they were having a holiday, and there was a regatta being held there. These were the days when there were regattas in Whitehead. And Margaret McCoubrey and her friends from England, who would have been members of the Pankhurst group, love coming and going between them. When they unfurled their banners to say, you know, we want the vote for women, they were chased into the sea by a crowd of drunken men. And Mr. McCoubrey and his friends had to go in and rescue them. So there was a lot of that kind of thing went on. They had no support either, and much more importantly perhaps, from leading politicians, whose attention was firmly fixed on the progress of the Third Home Rule Bill, which was at this time making its way through Parliament. And that again is another one of the tensions, probably the greatest tension, if you like, running through this period. It's probably also why we never knew so much about the suffragists, because this other thing was seen as much more important, the big constitutional issue. And of course, by this time, by the early 20th century, it was considered even more important, because new legislation passed by Lloyd George in 1911 meant that the House of Lords, who had held up the bill before, wouldn't be able to stop it going through anymore. So everybody knew that in 1912, a Home Rule Bill would make its way through Parliament. So there's again a highly important context here of the rising tension between nationalists and unionists. And of course for suffragists, the wider constitutional context in which suffrage was to be granted was significant, with important implications for future citizenship. So the tensions between gender and national aspirations were become yet another critical factor for politicised women in late 19th, early 20th century Ireland. Isabella Todd, for example, who died in the 1890s, I think, was an ardent Home Ruler. And when the first Home Rule Bill was introduced, she fell out with a lot of the Dublin suffragists and so forth, because she was so against Home Rule. So it was something else, as well as sort of the different aspirations of women, that had the potential to divide them. Because the suffrage battle was fought on many fronts. British feminists concentrated upon trying to force the Westminster government to pass a bill granting women the vote, as they were going through various great reform acts, extending the vote first of all to more middle class men, and then later in the 19th century to working men who had a property qualification and so forth. So that was what they were doing. Irish suffragists, on the other hand, were attempting to persuade the Irish Parliament in Westminster to have a provision for female suffrage included in that Home Rule Bill that was making its way through Parliament to give a measure of independence from Britain. While those wanting to maintain the union with Britain insisted that votes for women should be part of any deal. It's all very familiar now, isn't it? Because the Irish Party held the balance of power at Westminster. It was a minority Liberal government, and the women, everyone had expected the Liberal government to pass a suffrage bill. But the Irish Party voted against it and stopped it. They stopped, for example, the Conciliation Bill in 1912. They voted it down. The parallels are wonderful with where we are now. We keep intervening in things that are going on. But while women demanded home rule for Irish women as well as Irish men, John Redmond, the leader of the Irish Party, said he would never under any circumstances support female suffrage. His second in command, John Dillon, went as far as saying it would be the end of civilization as we know it. And you get this kind of cartoon appearing in the Irish Citizen. Hurrah for liberty, no Irish woman need apply. No votes for women by order, the new liberator, sort of referencing back to Daniel O'Connell. And this kind of no woman need apply was particularly for women who were of a nationalist bent and who wanted to see a free Ireland. But it's the same old question, do you battle from within or from outside? Do you just go with the nationalists and wait until you have your free Ireland and then assume that they'll give women the vote? Or is the woman question more important than anything else? And again, opinions were very divided to that. I particularly like this one. My dear fellow, we can't give votes to women. They are physically and mentally our inferiors, say two bedraggled and drunken aristocrats. Women are saying, hang on, things are changing for us. We can do it. And these people, what gives them the right? And I suppose even the House of Lords being diminished in its power was part of that sort of move away from aristocratic rights and the rights of privilege to a more democratic kind of system. But again, it was one that excluded women. While there was this division, suffrage leaders attempted to unite suffragists across these political divides. United Irish women, nationalist and unionist, militant and non-militant, and we'll come on to that as well. But keeping women together, keeping them focused on the women first idea. As Mrs. Cope from Armagh Suffrage Society, she said, I write from the purely unionist point of view. It seems to me imperative that all women of whatever political party should now stand for a great principle. The principle that no democratic government can be considered complete which ignores not only a class but a whole sex. Other unionist suffragists also put women's cause before that of the union. Mrs. Cook from Armagh, we've seen, Elizabeth Bell from Belfast, Mary Baker. As suffragists, we are to have a single aim until we have the vote. Party politics and party concerns are not for us, they said. And the Citizen newspaper was full of comments about women supporting the Irish Parliamentary Party or women supporting the Unionist Party were slaves to the men. They were just following in the men's footsteps and not standing up for themselves. But despite the official nationalist opposition to suffrage, for some feminist nationalists, the cause of Home Rule was a more immediate priority than the vote, arguing that as Irish women, they did not want the vote in a British, therefore hostile Parliament. Many women therefore joined one of the many cultural, literary, popular or political nationalist movements All female groups such as the Anida Nairn, I can never say that properly, or later Cumann na Man, and so forth. Or cultural movements, again you see this, let's get Ireland free, let's open this new dawn of Irish freedom, and in it women will be given the vote. And it's ironic really that it's always a woman who represents the island of Ireland. And of course, locally here, you had Alice Milligan, and again, like many women, focusing on Irish culture, the Irish language, really holding up to the light the importance of Irish heritage, of our Irish past. She edited, of course, Shan Van Gogh, published essays of Connolly, and I think was a much more significant figure than we've seen until relatively recently. Some who were more in favour of the Ulster Unionist determination to resist Home Rule were putting their energies into persuading the Ulster Unionists to give women the vote in whatever sort of arrangement that they could make. But as with nationalism, women did begin to organise specifically in this period of crisis in support of unionism. Especially, as I say, it became clear that Home Rule was likely to pass. What can we do to prevent this act from passing? What can we do to maintain Ulster's unique position? Parallels again. I watch the television during the day and think, goodness me, same arguments in many ways. The Ulster Women's Unionist Council was founded in 1911 specifically to oppose Home Rule. They sent speakers right across Britain to emphasise the fact that their anti-Home Rule unionist position wasn't just about Orangeism and rioting and marching bands, that there was an economic aspect to their position. This is the first meeting of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council. The historian Diane Urquhart has said that it was the largest organisation of women in early 20th century Ireland. You would have had the aristocrats up on the platform, but many working women and local women coming in behind them in support. The little book, United We Stood by Nancy Kingan, is a story of the early years of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, and it does make very interesting reading. So they very much joined with the men in opposing Home Rule and putting all their efforts into ensuring its defeat. On the 28th of January 1911, the Ulster Women's Unionist Council was formed. They mirrored the position taken by Sir Edward Carson in their hostility to the suffrage movement. They too felt that it was more important that the union was safeguarded. However, because they lacked the vote, they were deemed by the unionist hierarchy to be ineligible to sign the Solemn League and Covenant. This whole thing about not being citizens was something that the suffragists felt very strongly about. But in September 1912, in which 250,000 Protestant men pledged themselves in that covenant, 234,000 members of the Women's Council signed a Women's Declaration against Home Rule in September 1912. It has often been downgraded by historians because the women wrote that they opposed Home Rule in support of their men. Nonetheless, I think it was very significant that they organised and were able to present such a large petition and declaration. By 1913, this council had a membership of between 115,000 and 200,000 members. And again, context is important. The Pope had in 1907 issued a decree which said that in a mixed marriage, which would only be recognised if it was carried out in the Catholic Church, the children of any such marriage had to be brought up Catholic, and that there was an incident of a child being kidnapped and so forth to ensure that it was brought up in the correct faith. So Ulster women again had a rationale, if you like, behind their position, arguing that Home rule was essentially a women's question. It affected their lives, their homes and their families. And for that reason they affirmed their declaration to assist the men in opposing and defeating home rule. They argued that with the sanctity and happiness of home life faced with peril, and their religious as well as political identity under threat, it was women's duty, clearly, to reject a priest-governed Ireland. So the argument is about motherhood here, and it's saying there's a real threat. And the Pope's decree seemed again to be a justification to them for opposing an Irish Ireland. It was at this stage that things really began to reach a crisis point in a more physical way, with growing militancy throughout the island. Remember, both the Irish Volunteer and Ulster Volunteer forces had begun to arm. You remember the Larne gun running and so forth. All preparing for civil war. And you had women on each side supporting those positions. You had women supporting the men of the Irish Volunteer Force. You had Ulster Unionist women training as dispatch riders and as nurses in readiness for a civil war that might break out. You had everyone with this kind of militant fervour beginning to be prominent in society. Mary McSweeney, meanwhile, who had, I think she's a good example, she had been a member of Munster Suffrage Society. And from the nationalist side, she said in 1914, Ireland had the question of national sovereignty to settle. And to oppose the government now by insisting on suffrage would in effect mean to oppose home rule. And she left the suffrage movement and joined Cumann na mBan. And it was against this sort of background of rising militancy that those campaigning locally for the female vote also became more militant in their tactics. So, growing frustration, particularly after the Irish Parliamentary Party voting down the Conciliation Party and saying that they wouldn't support this at all. They had some experience of violence. This is Dr. Elizabeth, I don't know which is which, but one of them's Dr. Elizabeth Bell, one of the very first women to obtain a proper medical degree. In the earlier period, women qualifying in medicine were granted a kind of certificate. But Elizabeth Bell was one of the first to get a full doctor's degree, and Margaret Robinson from Whitehead had gone over to London to join the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, Pankhurst Society, and were arrested for breaking windows in a department store in London and spent some time in Holloway for their trouble. So they'd already taken part, many of these women, in militant actions in London. And as I say, members of the Pankhurst Society and particularly the Belfast Society came back and forward quite a lot. They were all speaking at each other's debates and conferences and so forth. So when the women's petition on home rule was ignored in 1912, you got 28 members of a new organisation, the Irish Women's Suffrage Federation, deciding that they too would opt for militancy. And they smashed the windows of Custom House in Dublin Castle. Again, there was a great deal of mockery of these middle-class women. Mary had a little bag, and in it was a hammer. For Mary was a suffragette, for votes she used to clamour. She broke a pane of glass one day like any naughty boy. A constable came along, and now she's in Mountjoy. And there was also the incident of Dublin, the suffragists throwing a hatchet at Asquith in the theatre. Now I was told, who would you believe, I was told that it was one of those little hammers that you use to break toffee. I don't know. She shouldn't have done it, of course, but still. Again, for this, the Dublin Castle incident, 2 women received a month jail sentence and another woman served 6 months in jail. In Belfast, the Irish Women's Suffrage Society, the one originally formed by Isabella Todd, held 47 open-air meetings in Belfast between 1912 and 1913, and acts of militancy became much more common. There were 3 pillar box attacks in Belfast in February, and then between then and April they did things like cutting wires and telephone boxes, posting firelighters through post boxes, as Elizabeth McCracken says, let it once and for all be understood that women in adopting such methods are only following a sort of natural law in the political world, a law they neither initiated or approved. Men have done both, as the whole history of reform proves. Have you seen the film Peterloo? Brilliant. But, you know, pointing out that any kinds of progress are sometimes made with violent actions. But it did divide the women in suffrage societies, and when you read local minutes and so forth, see women moving from one society to the other, either because they supported militancy or because they didn't. So women made their choices here. But the Belfast society was increasingly militant. So the battle lines were forming. But really, it was Carson, well, not Carson himself, but the Unionist Party who really brought things to a head. Dawson Bates, the chairman of the Ulster Unionist Council, wrote a letter to the secretary of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council saying that they had been looking at carving out a bit of the island in the northeast to separate itself and opt out of Home Rule, and if they did so, they would give women the vote. So this was greeted in the Irish Citizen by all kinds of mixed reactions. Nationalist women weren't quite sure what to do about this. Mrs. Priestley McCracken said, this is brilliant, this marriage between unionism and suffrage, this is great. Other people said, I don't know if I would believe that or not. And the WSPU started to really stalk Carson to find out what was behind this. And when they finally pinned him down, Carson said no, he would not under any circumstances give the vote to women. He didn't have the mandate to do it, and his party was divided on the whole thing. So at that stage, many of the suffragists declared war on unionism, and that's when things began to get very serious. The WSPU sent a woman called Dorothy Evans to Belfast, and this is her, with a couple of Scottish women. And they worked closely with the women in Belfast. In fact, the Belfast Society became more or less a branch of the Women's Social and Political Union. The local women welcomed the fact that, you know, these British women, other British women being there, would raise their profile. But for the Pankhurst, it was simply, right, you know, this is the way we'll get the vote. This Ulster movement, you know, they can get it if we put enough pressure on, so forth. They saw a way out of the Westminster refusal to grant the vote. The WSPU were received with much more hostility in Dublin, as you could maybe imagine. And you know, they were less popular down there. And this was another point of division between local suffragists. Did you support these English women or did you not? And again, nationalists said loyalty to Irish self-determination was an ideal held strongly enough to warrant opposition to the WSPU solely on the grounds that it is not Irish. Regarding the British government as alien, they insisted that the most successful Irish societies are those which have no affiliation with English organisations, but which are entirely native to Irish soil. And you will still get historians arguing about this. Was it a homegrown suffrage movement here, or, you know, did it all come about because of this sort of English invasion? I think the locals were well up for it and had showed what they wanted before that came along. So what you get in the spring and summer, early summer of 1914 are attacks on places used by Unionists, on other leisure areas. Nobody was ever hurt. They always made sure the buildings were empty. but they built, burnt down Newtonard's race stand, Ballylesson Church in Lisburn, Wallace Castle, Cave Hill Bowling Club, Ardmillan House in Fort William, Tea House in Bellevue, Annandale in South Belfast, places where, like this one, which is the worst one, I think, Abbeylands up on the Antrim coast, because the UVF drilled there. And again, they left suffrage literature behind them. They weren't hiding the fact that it was them who were doing this. And really, the Abbeylands one is particularly interesting because it caused a huge dramatic press reception. Police found explosives and a revolver at the flat where Dorothy Evans and her friends were staying. They were arrested, and the women protested that suffragettes were being prosecuted while Carson and his followers were allowed to go free, despite openly arming for the purposes of rebellion. And that was one of their key issues, how the authorities treated militant women and militant men so differently. At the court hearing, the newspaper said a right royal battle ensued, and there was much throwing of handbags and shouting and yelling, and dramatics went on. I don't know if any of you have seen the play that Kibosh do, which is a kind of interview with a suffragette, as the more militant ones were called, about why she was militant and so forth. At this stage in the suffrage campaign, having had in England 10 years of steadily increasing militancy that had resulted in many imprisonments but no concession from government, the WSPU had embarked upon a policy of absolute non-cooperation with male society. Women argued that because they were refused recognition as citizens, they refused to recognise the male legal authorities. And this explains their tactics in court and their immediate adoption of the weapon of the hunger strike. They were not looking for privileges in jail or so forth. They were fighting for their freedom, as they saw it, in the legislature. There was, of course, a great deal of difficulty with all of this. Many women suffered greatly during hunger strike, particularly before the Cat and Mouse Act was brought in. And again, it's only a small number of women here, but I'm sure you're all familiar with the Cat and Mouse Act, introduced in England and then applied also in Ireland. It came out in 1913, and by this act, hunger striking women were released when they became really too weak to be doing any harm, and before they became seriously ill. And then they were rearrested if they got up to any mischief when they recovered. And of course they were forbidden from undertaking any political activity while they were out under licence, but they normally ignored that. Dorothy Evans, for example, was arrested many times, judges finding it impossible to hold trials in face of her disruptive tactics. Evans' last arrest was with Lillian Metke of Lisburn Suffrage Society, and she too had changed from the non-militancy of the Lisburn Suffrage Society to become an enthusiastic member of the WSPU. And it's her story that the Kibosh group focus on in the play that they do. Lillian Metke was arrested for causing an explosion at Lisburn Cathedral on the 31st of July in 1914. Really, in the end, it's all very dramatic. A bomb in Lisburn Cathedral. It broke a window, which was probably a very ancient window, but they broke a window. And when the police came to arrest them, a mob gathered, and the suffragists weren't very well protected by the police, let's say, when they were taken to court in Belfast. So they too were imprisoned at this time. And what exciting scenes, the newspaper said, ensuing. Prisoners being attacked. At their trial, they again refused any bail and went on hunger and thirst strike. However, of course, as this was happening, something cataclysmic was occurring elsewhere. And here we see the outbreak of the First World War brought everything to an end. We saw Emmeline Pankhurst calling a truce between the government and the suffragists. And some of the Pankhursts became really ardent supporters of a patriotic war. Not all of them, Sylvia Pankhurst didn't. And there were many who disagreed strongly with that decision and who didn't support the war. Sylvia Pankhurst, as I've said, Dorothy Evans didn't agree with it either, kept in touch with her Belfast colleagues. The Irish Citizen headline on the outbreak of war was, "Votes for Women, Damn Your War." Margaret McCoubrey tried to set up a branch of the Irish Women's Franchise League in Belfast, and also she joined the Glasgow Women's Peace Crusade and tried to hold a big peace rally in Bangor, and again was chased out of there by a local mob. She spoke out against war on many occasions, saying, "A woman looking down on a battlefield doesn't see dead Germans or dead Englishmen, but so many mothers' sons." On the other hand, Dr. Elizabeth Bell had strong Unionist sympathies, and during the First World War worked in Malta for the war effort, while Dora Malone of Newry and Moran Point Society felt that suffrage should simply be kept on hold while women engaged in relief work during the war. There was, in other words, a great variety of reactions, but really the path taken by many of these women, and I've traced many of them through the 30s and so forth, was continuing to work on behalf of other women. Now we know that during the Great War, women participated in the war effort in a wide variety of ways, at home and abroad. Former suffragists, again we read in the Irish Citizen, took in Belgian referees, and many of these middle-class women were knitting and fundraising and so forth, collecting sphagnum moss for surgical dressings, or raising funds for the comfort or equipment for soldiers. And many also worked, like this group, in munitions factories. Very dangerous, horrible work really, but there's all sorts of opinions in that. Here we have Lady Londonderry, who herself supported votes for women, but not in any kind of militant way at all. An interesting woman in many ways. I've seen her as a supporter of fascism in some of her letters. But in 1915, she formed the Women's Legion, which was to train local women to take over the jobs vacated by men who had gone off to war. So they were drivers and chauffeurs and farmers and all kinds of things. It's quite interesting. She said they hadn't to be great hulking creatures in big uniforms, but they had to be sort of feminine and so forth while carrying out their work. I found her a very interesting woman, but this was one of the first voluntary organisations for women, and Lady Londonderry was seen as very important in that way. We also saw women again more heroically in many ways, or with more difficulty, as nurses and doctors going abroad. Many thousands of auxiliaries in the Voluntary Aid Detachment or in the Red Cross, in Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. At least 18 women of that unit died. Members of the Voluntary Aid Detachment, just said that, which had 4,500 Irish women. And as UVF nurses, those women who had been training for civil war instead turned their skills and their experience to the Great War. The Ulster Women's Unionist Council, for example, presented a fully equipped ambulance to the Ulster Division. Lady Carson opened a 86-bed UVF hospital in Belfast, and nurses from County Tyrone travelled to Pau in France to work in a hospital established by Ulster Unionists. So women turning their attention to a more patriotic cause, but one where they saw greater dangers to women, men and children alike. And of course, more later in the war, women were also able to join some of the armed forces. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps formed in 1915. I've lost my notes there. 1916. this is where I'm diverting a little bit from some of the work I've done. I don't usually use my notes, so I'm finding it awkward to have to go and look at to get dates right. The Wrens, which was extremely popular, was formed in 1917, and the Women's Royal Air Force in 1918. Somebody was talking to me today about how they didn't know that women were very often used to to fly planes from the factories where they were made to where they were needed. So not actually using their piloting skills to fight, but certainly contributing to the war effort. So we see that effort going on, but we also know that at the same time, while war was happening abroad, the 1916 Rising was happening in Belfast. And again, women were very much involved there. Locally in Belfast, 6 Cumann na Man members, Nora and Ina Connolly, Elizabeth and Nell Collin, Eilish Allen and Kathleen Murphy, all were sent down to act as couriers. They got word that a notice had come that the Rising was to be halted, cancelled and so forth, and they were supposed to meet up in Coal Island, I think it was, and instead had to go down, make their way to Dublin to report on what was going on and what was happening. And they were particularly important as couriers between Tyrone and Dublin. Winifred Carney, famously with a typewriter under one arm and a revolver under the other, took up a central position in the GPO and stayed with Connolly throughout. Countess Markievicz, of course, in the Irish Citizen Army, a different position from those in Cumann na Man, because she was armed and used her revolver. Now, we know the Rising failed, and there are some really good books out. Ruth Tylan did a great book some years back, I don't know if it's been updated, on women's role in the Rising, and they were very active. And Margaret has just lately added to that with new information that she has gathered while doing the Hannah Shee's Skeffington book on the contributions made to the Rising by women from the north as well as the south. You also at this time saw, I think what happened that seems to me to be the most important thing politically is that when the Rising failed and local opinion in Dublin turned to the support of the prisoners and those who had been shot, it really was the women who held Sinn Féin together at that time, who were very active on behalf of any remaining prisoners. Alice Milligan was visiting prisoners up in Crumlin Road Jail. There were all kinds of prisoners' aid societies set up, and they kept the administrative threads of Sinn Féin together while the leaders were in prison. They were also very active in the anti-conscription campaign across Ireland in 1918. So continuing to play their part in all different aspects of the tensions, of the violence, of the various eruptions of different kinds that were happening across Ireland. Well, of course we know that in 1918 the Representation of the People Act was passed. And that was a very important act, and there are still ongoing arguments about why they were given it. Was it to reward women for what they did in the war? Women have always worked, but of course they were much more visible during wartime. Would they have got it earlier if they hadn't been militant? I don't think so. There's all sorts of debates still about that. But by this act, men aged 21 and over, whether or not they owned property, could vote. And indeed, soldiers over 19 who had been fighting in the war were also given the vote. Women aged 30 and over who resided in the constituency or occupied lands or premises with a rateable value of about £5, or whose husbands did, they were given the vote. So this increased the electorate to about 21 million, 8.4 million of whom were women. And the age distinction there between women and men made sure that there weren't more women than men and again giving soldiers the vote at a younger age. And then the Parliament Qualification of Women Act allowed women over 21 to be elected as MPs. I just think how'd that happen, you know, when they had to be over 30 to vote, but they could actually stand as members of Parliament. And 2 women from Ireland did. Countess Markievicz, of course, who became the first woman to be elected, taking her seat not in Westminster, but in the first Dáil Éireann. A very significant factor, I think, in Irish history, beginning that not sitting in Westminster tradition, or policy really, that still goes on. Also standing in Belfast was Winifred Carney. She, as we know, had taken part in the Easter Rising, and she was a socialist. So she was standing, very courageous, I think. She stood as an independent socialist rather than as a Sinn Féin member. And she got no support at all from Sinn Féin, despite being an ardent nationalist. There's lots again written in feminist papers about Winifred Carney and this campaign. She was supported by some former suffragists like Alice Milligan, but really she didn't have a hope of winning a seat at that time. And we see that instead of the Great War, what we have is a continuing war, first of all with the British, and then with the Civil War following the signing of the treaty, which brought that to an end. And women continue to be involved in these struggles. In the War of Independence, or the Anglo-Irish War, in the post-Rising period, those branches of Cumann na Man that were formed in Antrim, Derry, Newry, Tyrone, Mid and South Armagh, Omagh and Dromore were very active. In 1921, during a sharp increase in loyalist violence in Belfast, the North Queen Street branch of Cumann na Man was formed at the request of the IRA. Annie Ward was the commanding officer, and Elizabeth and Nell Corr were among the 30 to 40 members. So you see that this is still all going on. Women, politicised women, pursuing their particular aspirations and political goals. And many members of Cumann na Man worked in tandem with the IRA during the War of Independence, and a number of the women served prison sentences in Armagh Jail as a consequence of that. In April 1922, the Special Powers Act, introduced by the new Northern Ireland Parliament, had declared Cumann na Man, along with the IRA, as an illegal organisation. So really they weren't very active in the north after that period. They played, although all the northern members rejected the treaty, they played no role really in the subsequent Civil War, which wasn't fought in the north. In January 1922, we see setting up of the Free State, which of course brings, a new constitutional premise where we see women in the Free State being given equal votes, equal voting rights with men in 1922, where women in the north don't get that equality until 1928. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Go back here again. Yeah. Northern Ireland then, of course, is set up. And I think it's important to note that in its early years, and indeed for some time afterwards, sectarianism filtered through all levels of Northern Irish society. I think it's something we all often miss when we talk about the constitutional and political position and sectarianism of a religious nature. But in the violence between July 1920 and June 1922, over 450 were killed, more than 1,100 wounded, 8,000 people forced out of their homes, and 650 homes and businesses destroyed. And so you see refugees from the north fleeing into the south. And against that background, the Home Rule Bill, which had passed in 1920, gave way to the setting up of Northern Ireland, and to new elections for Northern Ireland government. And there you see women of the UWUC also continuing in their campaign, and on this occasion going out and making sure that the Unionist women in the north are registered to vote, and educating them in the political means necessary to use their votes in support of unionism. So everybody sort of continuing on their political paths. And here, of course, we see the setting up of that new parliament, in which there were 2 women elected. And again, that's something that's often overlooked. We see Julia McMordy elected, and Deirdre Chichester Clark. She became Parker when she married again in 1928. Importantly, they were both members, they had both been leading members of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, and they saw their remit as serving the union and safeguarding the union. They didn't really have any feminine goals in mind. But Deirdre Chichester served for 35 years and was the only woman cabinet member, minister in the life of the Northern Ireland Parliament. So she is quite a significant figure. And this last slide is simply of the King's visit to the north in June 1921. King George V and Queen Mary coming to open the new Parliament, which was based firstly in the City Hall in Belfast. And this is Robinson Cleaver's building, with the sort of Ulster welcomes, the King and Queen and the massive crowd and all the rest of it. Actually, see, you can just about see down there the bank buildings, which is I was looking at yesterday, which are now in complete bits. But really, after this period, with so few women in Parliament on either side of the border, and certainly no women with liberal feminist views, with a country divided and laws passed that removed women from the workplace on marriage, the decades after the war did not introduce sexual equality, and the hopes of the suffragettes were not realised. Sorry, I rushed you through all that. I'm very happy to take any questions you might have. I know there were some bits there. The problem that I see with this, and it's in all of the talks that we do, that every person I mention or every event, I could do a whole lecture on it. So I'm condensing things very much. But if I can answer your question,